This week in Aristeia 101, the scenario is Conquest. The setup is a little different. First off, deployment is different in that you'll be going with zones 3 and 6. Now at the beginning of the deployment step, the underdog chooses one deployment zone to deploy their team in. Your opponent chooses the opposite zone. So the underdog will choose between either zone 3 or zone 6. After choosing the deployment zone, the underdog decides which player deploys a character first. Afterwards, both characters take their turns deploying one of their characters at a time until all characters are deployed. Now this is nice in that you can deploy inside of the deployment zone or adjacent to the deployment zone. Now, unlike assaults, the scoring zones are actually the center zone, as well as zones 1, 2, 4, and 5. Whenever characters are redeployed, they may return from the bench in zones 3 or 6, regardless of which one was their original zone. So there's still some choices to be made there. Now, this is all about conquering zones, laying claim to zones. To conquer a scoring zone at the start of the objectives phase, you must have more characters inside of it than your opponent does. Each player must choose color counters, green or orange, to mark zones conquered by their team. When a player conquers a scoring zone previously conquered by their opponent, they must remove the color counter of their opponent. So, for instance, whenever the green team conquers a scoring zone marked by the orange team, they remove the orange counter and place the green counter. A conquered scoring zone stops being conquered at the start of the objectives phase if there is at least one character inside of it and both players have the same number of characters inside of it. Remove all the green and orange counters on this scoring zone. Scoring zones remain conquered even if there is no character in them at the end of subsequent rounds. Now the objectives here during the objective phase of each round check whether either player has achieved any objectives. Reward them the appropriate victory points if they have accomplished the following. 1. Having more conquered scoring zones at the end of the round than the opponent. That's worth 2 victory points. Having the same number of conquered scoring zones at the end of the round the opponent is 1 victory point, but only if both players have conquered at least one scoring zone. There is no victory points if you're at 0-0. Finally, if you have conquered the central scoring zone at the end of the round, well, that's worth a victory point in and of itself. So really, you can get up to 3 victory points in a round. Kinda nice. The importance here with the central zone, however, is that can be kind of contested relatively easily. That's a high traffic area. So if you're tied, but your scoring zone happens to be the center one, that would be worth 2 points. It's kind of nice. Now the game ends as soon as either player scores 8 or more victory points, or at the end of the 5th round, whichever happens first. The player with the most victory points wins, and in case there is a tie, the winner is a player who collected the most frag tokens. Now there's a very important thing to note here, is that Gaia cannot play Tectonic Shake during this scenario. It is banned, it is forbidden. So if you like Gaia, you're going to have to keep that in mind. But likewise, if you play against a Gaia, remember that as well. That's one less thing for you to worry about. Even if they happen to be using the TCOM deck, if they cannot grab that tactic, it is forbidden. Now this is a great time to actually look at the zones. And so why would you pick 3 or 6? Well, honestly, it might be because one's prettier than the other, but also if you look at them, 6 has kind of got limited access going into it, not necessarily a big deal. 3 is a little more open until you look at how it interplays with 2 and 4. There's a lot more stuff in the way in terms of blocked spaces. But they can spread out fairly easily, your players. Who would like that? Well, I would have to say mobile characters like it, but Zone 6, you know, if you're using Bichet, maybe she might prefer that. If you're trying to run cover and have cover, 6 is not a bad place to start either. So that's one thing, and there's a lot of variables that go into this. You want to look at the starting setup in terms of which way, as an underdog, you know, does this benefit one of your characters or some of your characters more than others? 3's got a lot more wide open spaces on its side of things, so if you're using Hannibal or characters that really require line of sight, that's pretty good. If you've got more melee aristos, I think 6 gives you a lot to work with in terms of granting you cover. Likewise, if you look at Zone 3, right next to it is obviously Zone 2, and if you look from 3, the center, and 2, there's a lot of obstacles there. That may or may not matter for you, but if you've got characters that can manipulate the hexadome, such as, say, Hexer or Max by displacing things, or if you're using Gata, who can just jump over those, you know, you might want to favor 3, and you might want to favor zones 2 and 1 as well as the center. Nice things to keep in mind. So it's an interesting board, it's an interesting layout, and I like the way they set this up, partly because I know for me, when we play, it's often, you know, I get Zone 1, you get Zone 4, or vice versa, and it's kind of a very regularly set sort of thing. So changing what the deployment zones are, no, that's actually a really good way to shake things up. You don't have to go 1-4, and I know a lot of people who play that way because, well, that's the way it's shown in the manual. It's set up that way, and you kind of orientate yourself accordingly to how it's shown. So this is actually not one we've had a chance to try out yet, and hopefully we'll get to it sometime soon. So this is when you just kind of look at it, and it's going to be spread out. Again, the scoring is you want to have more zones scored than the other player. You want to, and you do that by outnumbering your opponent. So in this case, frags are obviously can be a little bit more important in this regard, because one less character or 2 less characters makes it harder for them to hold scoring zones. But the important thing is actually, and probably more obtainable, is abilities that inhibit movement. So negative movement from Major Luna, for instance, or immobilizes from Hexer, from Valkyrie, characters like that become kind of nice things to have. Likewise, negative energy, if you can impose it or keep it on the opponent, is kind of useful as well. Your limiting mobility is a great way, and often more reliable than actually trying to take somebody out, especially if they're a particularly high defense, or it's an ability, so they don't have to, the opponent doesn't get to make a defense roll. But no, this one looks like a lot of fun. You've got 5 zones to choose from, the center one getting, basically being worth double. You know, if you can camp out there, great. I would highly recommend, however, that you do not get too caught up on the center. It's important, but keep in mind the overall scenario in that you get the most victory points by holding more conquered scoring zones. So if you're constantly holding on to the center, but you're never conquering more zones, you're kind of giving up potential there. So just make sure you know, get it if you can get it, but don't overcommit to it. That will cause you problems. There's a reason it's worth 2, and if you lose characters trying to hold on to the center, what's going to happen is you're going to lose the ability to get the other zones as well. If you can, get 2 zones and the opponent's focused on just the center, well, that's just 1 zone. If you can get 3 zones, even better. See what I'm saying? So keep in mind, the holding the center is worth 1, and that's great, but don't get too hung up on it. Be flexible, be willing to concede, and move around. You've got 4 other zones you can play with. And that's it for Conquest. Looking forward to next week. Like, comment, and subscribe. We'll talk to you then.